Hi, I'm David Hamburger, and in this lesson, we're going to look at 10 ways to play House of the Rising Sun. I've got this tune on my mind lately because we're working on it this month in the Fingerstyle 5. The Fingerstyle 5 is my monthly membership where I teach people how to learn tunes, turn them into complete songs, and start to improvise on those songs. If you'd like to learn more, you can click on the link below or the link on screen. So the first way to play the tune is just to play the tune. Make sure you know what the chords are in the bass and play the melody as simply as you can on top, making sure that it's relatively accurate by listening to a few different versions of it and figuring out how the melody goes. So that might sound like this. Right? So it's an 8-bar blues, and the chords are A minor, D, which I'm playing with an F sharp in the bass, A minor, and then E7. That's the first 4 bars. And then A minor to D over F sharp again. And then a quick 2 beats on A minor, 2 beats on E, 2 beats on A minor, 2 beats on E. So that's the thumb laying down the groove and the chord progression with a steady bass. And then on top, the melody is made up almost entirely out of notes from, you could think of it as the A minor pentatonic scale or the A blues scale. Here's A, the root. We're adding in the note B, that's not from the pentatonic or the blues scale. C, that's the flat third of A minor. D, that's the 4th. E, that's the 5th. We're going to need this note. G, that's the flat 7. And then the root. So root 2, 3, 4, 5, flat 7, and root. That's pretty much all the notes of the melody. And then the melody is played in these phrases. And then. Finally. So if you can think of the melody in these 4 little groups, it's easier to remember the melody, and that will also come in handy later when we start to create some different variations like we're going to do. So putting these together, whoops, probably should use the thumb there. Or so that's the first way to do it. Just play the melody over the bass. Now the second way to do it is to think about the dynamics, just how loudly and softly you're playing to try to give some shape to the melody. I'm kind of exaggerating a little bit, but you notice that certain notes have more emphasis. And if you start to do it really on every other note, it can get a little sing-songy. But the idea is just to think about shaping the melody a little bit just based on how loudly and softly you play each note. So you're not just thinking of it as all at one dynamic, which is natural to do when you're learning the tune. You're just trying to play the notes and find them. But once you have them a little under your fingers, just start to think about what would be a more musical way to do it. And there really is no rule. There's no secret. It's just you sitting and thinking, what would sound cool? And finding that for yourself in a way that feels more musical. So that's the second way. The third way is to start thinking about the articulations. And this kind of goes hand in hand with the second way, which is the dynamics, which is, are you going to hammer on a note? Are you going to pull off a note? Are you going to slide? Already in that last example, I went up and I played the E here at the 5th fret on the 2nd string, because it lets me give a little vibrato to the note if I want to, instead of having an open string. So hammering on to the 1st note maybe into the 4th note. Maybe a little vibrato on that note, or maybe pulling off, landing here on the 5th fret of the 2nd string, hammering on here, pulling off, hammering on. Right? So putting those things together. And again, you don't want to do it. You don't want to necessarily do every possible hammer on or pull off. Just some hammer-ons and pull-offs. Whatever is going to give it, make it feel more musical to you, make it feel more relaxed, make it feel more natural. Okay, now we can add in some double stops. Here's the 4th thing we can do. So really just looking for, whenever we get to one of the longer notes in the melody, a note that's going to last for a little longer, kind of the landing points. Or maybe that's a shorter note, but now all I'm doing is just looking on the string below the note that the melody's on, below the string that the melody's on, and grabbing a part of the chord. So if I'm on this note here, I'm going to add in just a note below it from the A minor chord. Same thing here. So I'm taking, this is my melody note, I'm adding in this note from the chord underneath it. And then going to this chord here, the D, I'm going to grab the melody note here, and then here is the note below it. This is the 5th of the chord. And then here, I'm going to play, here's my melody. I'm going to go down to the 3rd string and grab the 5th fret on the 3rd string. That's the minor 3rd of the chord. And then hold that again when I have the 7th in the melody. So here I've got the root on top for the E chord, and here's the 3rd of the E chord. So here we're using closer intervals, 4ths and 3rds. And then here we're using bigger intervals like 6ths and 5ths. Melody note of the E. On the E chord, we're playing the 7th of the E. We're going to add in the 3rd of the E down here on the 3rd string. So that's double stops. And then, for the 5th thing we do, we can do some chord substitutions. So, on the 2nd half of the bar, of the 1st bar, we can swap in, for A minor, we can swap in a C, the relative major. And we can put the bass, put the 5th in the bass. So we get that sound. And that takes us to the D chord. And then in that measure on the D, we could go from D, or D7, to D minor in the 2nd half of the measure. But we can put the bass the third in the bass. So here's D. We've got the third in the bass here, the major third. We're going to go from F sharp to F, and that gives us, it looks like an F chord, but it's functioning like a D minor chord. And of course, these are basically the chords that you hear on the Animals version, which in turn, before that, they probably got them from the Bob Dylan version, and Dylan definitely got his version from Dave Van Ronk. And Van Ronk is probably the one who worked it out like that to have that descending bass line. So we can go from A minor to C with G in the bass to D over F sharp to F, A minor, and then we can still get, again, do the C over G. And then for E, we can do an E sus, like that. So instead of just going straight to a third of E and the high string, we can have the fourth of E. That's the suspension. And then this is bars 5 and 6. And then instead of going back to A minor, we can go to B minor 7 with the root and the flat third and the sevenths, to E7, and then F7. Here's the root, flat 7 and third, and then E sus to E. So that gives us this same melody, same double stops as much as we can. So those are 5 steps to get started. The melody, then adding some dynamics, then some articulations like hammer-ons and pull-offs, then some double stops, and then finally some chord substitutions. The next thing we can do is have some kind of vamp in between passes through the melody. So a vamp is really just something that you invent outside the shape of the tune itself. Often just a couple of chords rocking back and forth. In this case, we could use from the 1 chord to the 5 chord and back again. And we could keep this C note ringing out on top as a kind of common tone, a note that is in common to both chords. So here's A minor, and then here's E7 with the root, flat 7, third, and call it the sharp 5, you can call it the flat 13. So just keeping 2 notes going in the bass for A, and then 2 notes in the bass for E. So 1 and 2, and then anticipating the E chord on the and of 2 with the index, middle, and ring, picking the 4th, 3rd, and 2nd string. There's the E bass, and then grabbing the whole chord on the downbeat of 4. Letting go of the flat 13. So, and then maybe the second time, vary it by going up, putting the pinky down on the flat 7 on beat 4. So that gives us this. Time, and then you're all set up to go into the tune. So you could have the vamp, back into the vamp. pass through the melody. So the vamp can be a recurring thing, and just with these two pieces now, we've got a couple of ways to play through the melody, right? Because you could play it with and without the chord substitutions. And then you could drop the vamp in between passes through the melody. And then the seventh thing we can do, if the vamp is the sixth thing, the seventh thing we can do is add some fills to the vamp. So the vamp is this 2-bar repetition. But the second time through, we could change it and just put a lick in over the bass line. So just using the same notes that the melody's built out of. So the root, the flat third, the fourth, the flat 7, just those minor pentatonic notes. So just 2 bass notes. And they could be anything, but you can keep them really simple. Or more complicated. Right? But so I'm leaving the space blank where the ordinary part of the vamp would go. So now when you come around to the vamp, you can vary it a little bit. So that's the 7th thing you can do. The 8th thing you can do is start to improvise. So keeping the form of the tune, keeping the bass doing what it does during the melody, but starting to make up something new to play. And the simplest thing you can do to start improvising does not have to be this big complicated thing made out of whole cloth. You can just start with the phrasing of the melody. And you can even just take the melody and see if you can play it over the first, say, 6 bars, right? It's going to work over the opening 2 bars because it is the melody. But if you then repeat that over the second 2 bars, it starts to sound different because that's not where the melody goes. Maybe a little double stop. And then for the last 2 bars, you could play some blues. And you could even start to play maybe those chord substitutions underneath it. So that's the 8th thing you can do. The 9th thing you can do is take a different part of the melody and try that. So if you take the second phrase of the melody and start at the beginning of the tune with that, it actually sounds pretty cool. You could play that melody 3 times and then answer it with a blues lick. So now, of course, you could also be putting in some double stops and some hammer-ons. Or, again, the chord substitutions. But that's the 9th thing you can do is take a different part of the phrase and use that as the basis for improvising. And once you've got that rhythmic shape, you could start to vary what notes you go to. You don't have to stick to the melody, obviously, because it's supposed to be improvising. So the rhythmic outline of the melody as this container to put different kinds of notes from the blues scale into. But the last and 10th thing you can do is to start to just invent something brand new. And one of the most reliable ways to do that is to think in terms of some call and response phrasing. So maybe a short phrase that leads into the downbeat, and then a short answer to that, and then a longer phrase that leads into the E chord to give it a sense of resolution. And then again, and then end with the blues lick. So that kind of phrasing, and 4 and 1 and, is really ubiquitous in blues. It's really common. It's used for blues melodies, for tunes. It's used for blues licks, and it's just a good one to have in your back pocket. And 4 and 1 and, or just and 4 and 1 with a short answer, and then the whole thing answered by and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and a longer phrase like that. So once you have those kind of rhythmic shapes, you have a whole point of departure then that you can use. So from the very beginning, once again, you can just play the melody and know the melody. That's the first step. Then add some dynamics. That's the second step. Start to articulate what you're doing with some hammer-ons, pull-offs, slides, vibrato. Fourth, add some double stops to support the melody using things like thirds and fourths and sixths and fifths. And then chord substitutions is the fifth step, and maybe looking for some kind of descending bass line or having some kind of logic to what's going on. And once you have those chord substitutions, you can use them with any of the previous things that we talked about. The sixth step is to add a vamp, which comes from outside the tune, a short rocking 2-bar idea. The seventh idea is to add some fills to that vamp. The eighth way to play through the tune is to take the opening line of the melody and use that as a basis for improvising, answering it with blues licks. The ninth way is to take a different phrase from the tune. I use the second phrase of the melody in bars 3 and 4, and use that as a basis for your ideas and answer that with blues licks. And the 10th way is to improvise from scratch using the idea of short and long resolutions, short and long phrases to build up ideas of your own. Just using the basic blues scale, but incorporating all the other ideas about articulation and dynamics and double stops and chord substitutions into the mix. And that way you can go through the whole tune a handful of times using just a few very simple elements that mostly come from right within the tune to build a pretty complete sounding instrumental arrangement of an 8-bar blues. So again, for a more in-depth, ongoing way to work on learning tunes, turning them into songs, and starting to improvise, check out the Fingerstyle 5 membership at the link below or the link on screen. If you got any comments, leave them below. I'd love to hear from you, and I'll see you next time.